communism. It'll transcend communism. It will dismiss it as some bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages are even now being written.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Signed the first agreement ever to eliminate an entire class of U.S. and Soviet nuclear weapons. We have made history.
The Russians had been our de facto enemies for almost 65 years. All this while, their policies had been devoted to the single purpose of destroying democracy and imposing communism. At my first press conference, I was asked whether we could trust the Soviet system.
They reserve unto themselves the right to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat. I think when you do business with them, you keep that in mind.
I deliberately set out to say some frank things about the Russians, to let them know there were some new fellows in Washington who had a realistic view of what they were up to and weren't going to let them get away with it. The Soviets were more dedicated than ever to achieving a one-world communist state. In Afghanistan, they were brutally trying to suppress a revolt against communist rule with tanks and rockets. I wanted peace through strength, not peace through a piece of paper. I decided we had to send a powerful message to the Russians that we weren't going to stand by anymore while they armed and financed terrorists and subverted democratic governments.
The Soviets assert that a balance of intermediate-range nuclear forces already exists. That assertion is wrong. They now enjoy a superiority on the order of 6 to 1.
When President Reagan was inaugurated, no one suspected that Reagan would become what he in fact did become. A leader who would stand firm and challenge the system in the most vigorous way.
Building on the success of his economic recovery, Reagan led the push for the modernization of America's armed forces, terminated all hard currency transactions and technology sales to the Soviet Union, and with key ally British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and Pope John Paul, rallied the free world, speaking for the millions behind the Iron Curtain who looked to the West for help.
We, the people of the free world, stand as one with our Polish brothers and sisters. Their cause is ours. The United States believes that respect for human rights is not social work. It is not merely an act of compassion. It is the first obligation of government and the source of its legitimacy. It also is the foundation stone in any structure of world peace.
During my watch as president, there was nothing I wanted to do more than lessen the risk of nuclear war. For 40 years, nuclear weapons had kept the world under a shadow of terror, mutual assured destruction. The idea of deterrence providing safety so long as each of us had the power to destroy the other with nuclear missiles if either of us launched a first strike. I wanted to go to the negotiating table and end the madness of the MAD, MAD policy. And that fall in Geneva, after exchanging several letters with him, I got the chance I'd been hoping for to get a Soviet leader alone in a room. And I told Gorbachev, here you and I are, probably the only two men in the world who could bring about World War III. But by the same token, we may be the only two men in the world who could perhaps bring about peace. There was much more to be done, but we had laid a foundation in Geneva. The following year, we met again, this time at Reykjavik, Iceland.
The question, of course, around here is whether the glass is half empty or half full.
At Reykjavik, my hopes for a nuclear-free world soared briefly, then fell during one of the longest, most disappointing, and ultimately angriest days of my presidency.
At the very last moment, the Soviets insisted that Reagan effectively abandon his strategic defense initiative. It was time to take a stand.
Every offensive weapon ever invented by man has resulted in the creation of a defense against it. So the SDI was born. It had been the Strategic Defense Initiative that had brought the Soviet Union to Geneva and Reykjavik, and I wasn't going to renege on my promises to the American people not to surrender the SDI. I realized he had brought me to Iceland with one purpose, to kill SDI.
The president immediately refused, and the Soviets understood that their last gambit had failed.
I think history will show that it was a major turning point in the quest for a safe and secure world. We agreed on the basic terms for what 14 months later would become the INF Agreement, a treaty that for the first time in history provided for the elimination of an entire class of nuclear weapons. Political opponents had called me a saber rattler, and a right-wing extremist. I'd call the Soviet Union an evil empire. Now I had extended my hand and a smile to its highest leader. The world was approaching the threshold of a new day. We had a chance to make it a safer, better place for now and the 21st century.
He played perhaps the greatest role of all presidents of the United States ever in advancing the cause of freedom, which eventually led to the collapse of the system.
It is, however, for fighting and winning the Cold War that Ronald Reagan deserves the most credit. And credit not just from Americans, but from the rest of what we called in those days the free world, and from those in the former communist states who can now breathe the air of liberty.
Freedom is the right to question and change the established way of doing things. Freedom is the recognition that no single person, no single authority or government has a monopoly on the truth, but that every individual life is infinitely precious and has something to offer.
Every victory for human freedom will be a victory for world peace.